The island of Cuba is less than 100 miles away from the southernmost tip of Florida. However, the relationship between the American and Cuban governments has always been a bit complicated. Here are the 6 moments in American-Cuban relationships which illustrate our complex history, most of which you should recognize, and a few that might surprise you. In 1898, 647 U.S. Marines landed at Guantanamo Bay and tie up Spanish troops, protecting future President Teddy Roosevelt's famous charge up San Juan Hill, 40 miles to the west. 5 years later, in the Treaty of 1903, the Cuban government agreed to lease areas around Guantanamo Bay to the U.S. for a naval station, the beginning of the U.S.'s oldest naval base, and its only one on communist soil. Flash forward now 61 years later. It's 1959 and Fidel Castro is now in power in Cuba after an armed revolt overthrew the dictator Batista. The U.S., to say the least, are not very big fans, especially of Castro's relationship with the leader of the USSR, Nikita Khrushchev. JFK is elected in 1960, and before his inauguration is briefed on a plan by the CIA, developed during the Eisenhower administration, to train Cuban exiles to invade their homeland, eventually overthrowing Castro. JFK authorizes the plan. April 17, 1961, an invasion force of Cuban exiles lands at the Bay of Pigs and immediately come under heavy fire. By the next day, more than 100 have been killed, and almost 1,200 members of the force have surrendered. They remain in captivity for 20 months until they are eventually traded for $53 million worth of baby food and medicine. The operation was a disaster. After the Bay of Pigs, Castro goes full communist. Catholic schools were being closed, and some people were freaking, hoping to escape to friendlier shores. Across the ocean, Father Brian Walsh in Miami makes a deal with the U.S. State Department to sign visa waivers for children 16 or under. And soon there were 2 direct Pan Am flights every day from Havana to Miami, full of kids, some without families. In the end, some 14,000 Cuban children made it to the U.S., establishing a Cuban legacy. All right, so we got a little island off the coast of the United States, a vast intercontinental global Cold War, and nuclear weapons that can end life as we know it. What could go wrong? October 1962, U.S. spy plane grabbed pictures of nuclear missile sites being built in Cuba. The U.S. builds a quarantine of ships and we are pushed to the brink of war. The crisis is eventually averted, making this both our best and worst moment in human history. It's April 20th, 1980. Fidel Castro proclaims that any Cuban wanting to go to the U.S. can board a boat in the port of Mariel. Good news, right? Well, it turns out that some of the 125,000 Cubans, packed into 1,700 boats, had been released from Cuban jails and mental facilities. Many Americans weren't too happy. Picture Scarface landing in Florida soil.
I'm Tony Montana, a political prisoner from Cuba.
Many of the Mariel refugees decided to live in Miami, increasing the city's Cuban working population by 20%, and further blending Cuban and American culture. Again, jump 20 years and another Cuban has made it to the shore of America. 5-year-old Elian Gonzalez is found on Thanksgiving Day 1999 on an inner tube 3 miles off the coast of Florida. He is released into custody of his uncle, Lazaro, while the Cuban government asks the U.S. to return young Elian. A long, complicated court battle ensues. Eventually, his father arrives in the U.S., and armed federal agents seize Elian from his U.S. relatives and return him to the custody of his father. 2 months later, Elian is back in Cuba. Now, it's been over 100 years since U.S. troops landed in Guantanamo Bay. Tensions between the 2 countries have relaxed after a recent U.S.-Cuba prisoner swap. What will happen in the future? No one knows.